Welcome back, friends. I hope you all are doing fine and watching the videos and solving all the PYQs we have added in the app. Anyway, today we are taking on chapter 12, Structuralism. You know, it is one of the most important sessions in our literary criticism unit. Here we are covering a lot of ground, not only criticism, but also I'm taking you to linguistics. That means structuralism is all about linguistics. That's the base of structuralists. So let's decode one of the most influential movements in literary theory, structuralism. It began around 1949, drawing its roots from linguistics, but quickly spreading into anthropology, philosophy, literature, and cultural studies. The basic idea is simple yet powerful. Don't look at things in isolation, look at the system. Everything gains meaning only in relation to something else. That's why the term structuralism, first coined by Edward Bradford Titchener, is all about analyzing fields as interrelated parts of a larger structure. Pause here and note this down. It was asked in exam. Structuralism is concerned with signs and signification. And at its very foundation stands Ferdinand de Saussure, whose course in general linguistics, published in 1916, gave us one of the most important distinctions in theory: the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the sound or written form of a word, while the signified is the concept it represents. Together, they form the sign. Now, here's the golden trick. This relationship is arbitrary. There is no natural link between the word tree and the leafy thing outside your window. Yet, without these conventions, reality itself cannot be understood. Don't forget this point, that all signs are arbitrary, but without them, we cannot comprehend reality, was asked in exam. Can you recall how meaning is produced here? Exactly not in isolation, but in difference. The word tree only gains clarity when contrasted with plant or bush. Meaning is relational, not absolute. This is why structuralism breaks away from the older idea that literature is just a mirror of reality. It insists instead that literature is part of a self-contained structure of language, where meaning emerges from codes, oppositions, and cultural systems. And yes, this shift, that literature does not merely reflect reality, was also asked in exam. From here, structuralist linguistics inspired entire schools across Europe. The Geneva School with Albert Sekehaye and Charles Bailly, the Prague Circle with Roman Jakobson, the Copenhagen School with Louis Hjelmslev, the Paris School with André Martinet and Algirdas Greimas, and the Dutch School with Simon Dick. And this was also asked in exam. Each applied structural methods to language, phonology, and narrative. But it didn't stop there. Claude Lévi-Strauss took these ideas into anthropology, analyzing myths and kinship. Roland Barthes and Umberto Eco explored cultural codes. Michel Foucault and Mikhail Bakhtin pushed these insights into discourse and dialogism. Structuralism became a global method to study how systems, not individuals, shape meaning. And then came the critics. Post-structuralists like Jacques Derrida and Louis Althusser argued that even structures are unstable, that meanings can never be fully fixed. But remember, without structuralism, post-structuralism wouldn't even exist. So, the legacy of structuralism is clear. It laid the foundation for semiotics and modern literary theory, giving us the framework to see language not as a passive mirror, but as the very system through which we construct our world. Let's talk about the giant who completely reshaped how we think about language, Ferdinand de Saussure. He is not only my personal favorite, but also UGC and ET loves his contribution because almost two questions they always ask from his ideas. Born in 1857 and passing away in 1913, Saussure was a Swiss linguist, philosopher, and semiotician. He is widely regarded as the father of modern linguistics and semiotics. His revolutionary ideas were published posthumously in the book Cours in General Linguistics, also known as Cours de Linguistique Générale. Pause here and note this. It was compiled by his students Charles Bailly and Albert Sekehaye in 1916 at the University of Geneva, based on lectures he gave between 1906 and 1911. And yes, this detail was asked in exam. Saussure changed the focus of linguistics. Before him, scholars mostly studied language historically. comparing older and newer forms. But Saussure said, hold on, let's also study language as it exists at a single moment in time. This is what we call the synchronic approach. In contrast, studying language across time is the diachronic approach. Pause here because this distinction of synchronic versus diachronic was also asked in exam. At the heart of his theory lies the concept of the sign. Saussure explained that every linguistic sign has two inseparable parts, the signifier, which is the sound image, and the signified, which is the concept or meaning. The link between them is not natural, it is arbitrary. For example, there's nothing natural about calling a four-legged animal dog. It's simply a convention agreed upon by a community. Can you recall another important distinction? Saussure separated langue, the structured system of rules shared by a community, from parole, which is the individual act of speech. In simple terms, langue is the social structure of language, while parole is personal use. This was one of the most influential ideas of the 20th century. Saussure also gave three main objectives for linguistics. First, to describe and trace the history of all languages. Second, to identify universal forces operating within all languages. And third, to define the boundaries of linguistics itself. By doing this, he positioned language not as a simple labeling tool, but as a structured system that shapes human thought and culture. And here's something you'll love. Saussure's ideas didn't stop at linguistics. They influenced philosophy, psychology, anthropology, sociology, and of course, literary theory. Without Saussure, we wouldn't have structuralism, semiotics, or many of the critical theories that dominate 20th century thought. Now, Ferdinand de Saussure's most important contributions from his course in general linguistics, the difference between language and speech, clarified through what he calls the speech circuit. Imagine two people having a conversation. It starts in the brain of the first person, the concept forms. It travels into sound waves through speech and then enters the ear and mind of the listener. But here's the golden trick. Saussure says this process is not just about biology or sound, it's about language, or what he calls la langue. Language is a structured social system made up of rules and signs that we inherit from our community. It is not created individually, it is shared and stable. Pause here and note this down. Language is social, collective, and homogeneous. On the other hand, speech or la parole is individual. It's where people make choices, use tone, express themselves. Speech is variable, creative, and personal. Can you recall which one linguistics studies? Exactly, language, not speech. Because language is the code, the stable structure, the part we can analyze scientifically. Saussure even calls language a kind of social contract. We all agree to follow its rules without consciously deciding to. That's why he insists linguistics is not about cataloging personal utterances, but about studying the underlying system that makes communication possible. Now here's the golden detail, the speech circuit. It shows how meaning comes from both the internal concept and the external sound image. And together they form the linguistic sign. But remember, Saussure's big idea is that signs don't carry meaning on their own. They mean something only because they differ from other signs in the system. In other words, language works by differences, not by fixed essence. This is why Saussure connects linguistics to semiology, the science of signs, and links it with fields like sociology, anthropology, and psychology. Language, he argues, is not natural or biological. It's a symbolic system shaped by collective behavior. So, for Saussure, general linguistics becomes the study of this sign-based system. It's phonology, semantics, morphology, and grammar, always using text and speech as data, but focusing on the structure beneath. Let's discuss the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, often called the father of modern structural linguistics. Born in 1857 and living until 1913, Saussure transformed how we think about language. In his posthumously compiled book, Course in General Linguistics, published in 1916, he introduced something called the speaking circuit model. This is a simple yet powerful way of showing how communication actually works. Pause here and note this down. It was asked in exam. Saussure argued that communication is always dyadic. That means at least two people are needed, a speaker and a listener. Without both, there's no complete act of communication. The speaking circuit isn't just about words flying through the air. Saussure breaks it into three levels. First, the psychological level, where the speaker forms an idea and the listener interprets it. Second, the physiological level, where the mouth produces sound and the ear receives it. And third, the physical level, where sound waves travel through the air. Can you recall what this means? Exactly, communication is both mental and material, an ongoing loop between two minds. The process starts when the speaker connects a concept, the signified, with a sound image, the signifier. This link is then spoken aloud. The sound waves travel, the listener hears them, and in their mind, the same concept is reactivated. So meaning is not stored in the sound itself, but in the shared code of language that both participants use. And here's where it ties back to structuralism. Saussure believed language is not a list of words with fixed meanings. Instead, it is a system of interrelated signs where meaning comes only through differences. A word doesn't mean what it means because of an inherent essence. It means what it means because it is not another word. So the speaking circuit is the practical, diachronic side of his theory, how language actually functions in real communication, while his idea of lang represents the social code that underlies it all. Together, they remind us that language is both structure and process, both system and practice. Let's discuss one of the most important ideas in modern linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure's distinction between langue and parole. This is foundational for structuralism. And yes, it was asked in exam several times, so make sure you underline it. Now, what exactly is langue? Think of it as the system of a language, the grammar, the rules of syntax, the sound system, and the shared conventions that every speaker of a community follows. It's abstract, collective, and social. You don't invent lang on your own. It exists outside you, almost like a ready-made system into which you are born. In contrast, parole is much more personal. It is the individual act of speaking or writing the actual utterances we produce in daily life. That includes accents, mistakes, innovations, and all the variations of speech. While linguists study lango as a scientific object of language, they rely on parole, on actual text and speech to analyze how the system works. Pause here and note this down. Saussure described langue as a kind of algebra of science, separate from biology or psychology. Later, thinkers like Louis Hjelm-Slev in his Prolegomena to a Theory of Language published in 1943 pushed this idea further by using symbolic logic to study language. This model was later challenged. In the United States, linguists like Zelig Harris and especially his student Noam Chomsky took a very different path. Chomsky argued that language is not just social, it's also biological. His theory of universal grammar described an innate mental capacity for language, contrasting with Saussure's socially grounded language. Notice how this parallel works. Saussure gave us langue versus parole, and Chomsky reformulated it as competence versus performance. Can you recall the other important axis in Saussure's model? Yes, synchronic versus diachronic linguistics. A synchronic study looks at a language at one point in time, almost like taking a snapshot of its structure. This is the approach Saussure preferred. A diachronic study, on the other hand, traces how language changes over time, for example, from Old English to Modern English. And one more detail you must remember, Saussure distinguished between syntagmatic and paradigmatic relations. Syntagmatic refers to the linear sequence of words in a sentence, like how grammar structures a chain. Paradigmatic refers to the choices we can make at each point, like selecting road instead of path, in Frost, the road not taken. That single choice shifts the nuance of meaning. So, to simplify, lang is the social system, parole is individual use. Together, they became the cornerstone of structuralist thought, and they remain central to how we understand language and literature today. Let's talk about Ferdinand de Saussure's game-changing idea from his course in general linguistics published in 1916. Saussure argued that language is not a simple mirror of reality but a system of signs, and every sign has two parts, the signifier and the signified. Pause here and imagine this with me. The signifier is the sound image or the material form of a word, like the word tree when you hear it or read it. The signified is a concept in your mind, the mental picture of a tall plant with a trunk and branches. Together, signifier plus signified equals the sign. Now here's the surprising part. Saussure emphasized that the connection between the two is completely arbitrary. There is nothing natural that ties the word dog to the actual animal. Another language uses chien in French or kutta in Hindi, and yet all point to the same animal. This shows that meaning is not in the sounds themselves, but in the system of differences that a language creates. Pause and note this down. This arbitrariness of the sign is one of Saussure's most revolutionary insights. He said, the bond between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. That arbitrariness is exactly what makes language flexible, diverse, and able to evolve over time. Can you recall what this means for meaning itself? It means that words don't carry meaning on their own. They gain meaning only in relation to other words. Think of cat and bat. Neither has meaning in isolation. Instead, they gain significance through their differences within the system. So, what Saussure really gave us was a structuralist model of language. Instead of words reflecting reality, language is a self-contained system where every part is defined not by an external truth but by its relation to everything else. That's why Saussure is often called the father of modern linguistics, and his idea of signifier and signified remains a foundation for structuralism and beyond. Let's decode Ferdinand de Saussure's revolutionary idea about language. In his course in general linguistics, published posthumously in 1916, Saussure changed the way we think about words. Before him, many thought of language as a list of names for things that already exist, like labels stuck onto objects. But Saussure argued differently. He said language is not just a nomenclature. Instead, it's a structured system where meaning comes from relationships, not from inherent value. Pause here and note this down. It was asked in exam. Saussure defines language as a system of signs, and each sign has two parts: the signifier, which is the sound image or the written form, and the signified, which is the concept in our mind. But here's the golden trick: these signs don't stand alone. They only mean something because of their differences from other signs. For example, the word cat makes sense only because it's not bat, not cut, and not cut. Meaning, in this model, comes entirely through difference. Can you recall what this implies? Exactly, language is an interlocking structure where each unit depends on its place within the system. That's why Saussure insisted that language is self-contained and internally regulated. It doesn't need to point to the external world to work. Instead, it operates like a game with rules set by the system itself. Now here's something important for UGC Net. Saussure also saw language as a social institution. It's not created individually but through collective agreement within a community. And yes, it does change over time. That's the diachronic aspect. But Saussure's main focus was synchronic study, looking at language as it exists at a single point in time as a system of interdependent signs. Let's decode an important connection, the Durkheimian legacy in Saussurean linguistics. This has been asked in exam, so pay extra attention. Emile Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, gave us two powerful ideas: social facts and collective consciousness. Social facts, according to him, are realities that exist outside the individual and yet shape individual behavior. Think about laws, customs, religious practices, or even moral codes. They exist whether we like them or not, and they often constrain us. Collective consciousness, on the other hand, is the shared system of values and beliefs that holds a society together. Together, these ideas explain how society exerts a powerful influence on the individual. Now here's the golden trick. Ferdinand de Saussure, the father of modern linguistics, took inspiration from Durkheim's concepts. Saussure argued that language is not a private possession of individuals. Instead, it is a collective institution, something that exists before us and after us. Can you recall his famous distinction? Yes, langue and parole. Langue is the social fact of language, the shared vocabulary and grammar that everyone in a community follows. Parole is the individual's act of speech, the personal way of using language. No one person owns langue. It only exists through the collective agreement of the linguistic community. Pause here and note this down. This is where Saussure aligns linguistics with sociology. Just as Durkheim said laws or customs exist beyond us, Saussure showed that language, too, is a system bigger than any one individual. It shapes our thought, our communication, and even the way we perceive reality. So the bridge between Durkheim and Saussure is clear. Both place the collective above the individual. For Durkheim, social facts ensure solidarity in society. For Saussure, langue ensures stability in communication. In both cases, meaning and order don't come from isolated individuals, but from the collective life of the community. That's why this question keeps reappearing in exams. It's a brilliant example of how sociology and linguistics meet within the structuralist tradition.